Good evening, America. Good morning, Australia. And in some parts of Australia, good afternoon. You're listening to Everyday Business Radio Toni with Toni Lontis and our wonderful co-host, Lisa Coletta. So just a reminder, you can catch up on all things Radio Toni on the Radio Toni website, which is radiotoni.com. Catch us live. We're live streaming now on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitch, and YouTube. So we're coming to you live across the planet. Just a quick shout out to the guys at BBS who are noticing some amazing growth of the station at the moment, alongside with my own growth, and my sound is playing up today. I hope you can still hear me. We are going to continue today our wonderful series with Lisa Coletta from the Governance Collective, and we've been talking all things organisational, governance, leadership, structure, and this week we want to continue our subject of heart-centered leadership. But before we do that, I just want to reintroduce you to our amazing host. So Lisa Coletta is passionate about corporate governance, and she's an up and coming Australian thought leader and change maker. And she works with senior specialists that shape, drive, and implement the right sized, effective governance policy and frameworks and processes to have you shining in your business. She's worked in both the public and private sector, advising chairs, boards, CEOs, committees, managing directors, and executives on corporate governance, HR, and delivery of business strategy. She is a well-educated entrepreneur, having a master's degree in management, a postgraduate applied corporate governance, and she's a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. So last week we talked about team management, and how companies can invest in the happiness of their employees, and how this has benefits for businesses, companies, and corporations, no matter what their size. And so we want to continue that discussion this week and focus more on heart-centered leadership. Good morning, Lisa.
Good morning, Toni. Great to be here today.
I'm really excited to continue our conversation. In the preparation for this show, Lisa and I have a one-on-one meeting, and I always leave those meetings thinking, I can't wait for the show to talk about this stuff. And so when I say stuff, I'm talking about leadership in business. And this week, I know from our discussion and the research and literature around leadership that they're all different sorts of leadership. But for the purposes of today, we particularly want to talk about ego-led leadership versus heart-centered leadership, and why it's important and why they're different. So Lisa, let's start with one of your stories about your journey from ego-centered leadership to heart-centered leadership.
Yes, Toni. I also enjoy our pre-show chats, and as we discussed the other day, I've had my own journey. I think we all have, in different ways, learnt a lot about ourselves over time. For me, my journey was a bit of an interesting one, because I was really fortunate that I was in really great learning environments, and as part of my career progressed, and I had great mentors around me. And interestingly, in hindsight, I guess that's when you tend to learn the most. A lot of the leaders that were around me at the time had taught me what to do, and also taught me what not to do, even though some of the behaviours were acceptable in the environment that I was in. I think that for me, I actually found myself doing a lot of spending a lot of time learning how to be in those environments based on whatever behaviours were being mirrored to me by the senior leaders around me. So what tended to occur was that, they say that any behaviour that you choose to walk past is a behaviour that then gets accepted. So, I kind of look back and I think about some of the behaviours, and knowing myself as well as I do know now, Yeah, there was a lot of ego-centered behavior and very personal agenda driven type behaviors, a
Yes.
lot of competitive behavior. There wasn't,
Yeah.
I felt like I was being supported, but I also didn't really recognize that there was a bit of an inner circle there, that I was actually
Yeah.
really, really working hard to be part of, as opposed to knowing myself well enough around whether I should or shouldn't be, behaving that way just to go along to get
Yeah.
along, in those kinds of
Yeah.
environments. It's a really, really interesting thing. I think that for me, my real turning point was that I was actually getting quite unwell. I was starting to get very, very anxious, and I'd never suffered anxiety before. I didn't even know what anxiety was. And I started
Yeah.
having panic attacks, and I'd never had a panic attack in my life. I thought I was, dying the first time I had one. And what I did at that point was I kind of had to stop, because I had to sort of stop and have a really good look at my life. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, for a lot of us at that time, I had a young family. I needed the dollars and I wanted to hold on to the job. But I also knew
Yeah.
that the dynamics that were playing out around me were not healthy for me, and something had to
Yes.
change. And as much as at the time I felt that it was everyone else's fault, it was the behavior of everyone else, it was everyone else making me feel sick and bloody blur. What was really going on was that I had complete incongruence in my body between my mind and my heart. That head, heart, gut
Yes.
thing is very, very strong. I knew deeply within my gut that I wasn't behaving in the way that was actually my true self. I knew that the people around me were also doing the same thing for themselves. But I also allowed individuals to kind of own my future and own my areas of focus, and own me, owned who I was and
Yeah.
what was the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do. And it's a really interesting
So
thing, I think, Toni. Sorry, your question?
I was just going to say, so in clarifying the difference, you were acting in a way, or leading in a way that was acceptable for the most part, or and acceptable for the high level position that you held, but it wasn't exactly who you were. So you were performing a role to everyone else's expectations, but not to your own.
Not to my own. Exactly right. I was achieving really great outputs and outcomes. I knew I had a skill set and a natural, I guess, ability and tendency to deliver certain kinds of work outputs that the organisation
Yes.
needed. And in one particular example, I ended up starting to work I befriended a leader in another area of the business who ended up hiring me in a role with them. And I just found
Yes.
myself, I love the work. The work was amazing. The behaviors that I accepted around me and towards me were really quite unacceptable in hindsight. But again, I was so appreciative that someone had actually had chosen me and was mentoring me to build me up to what I thought was in the best interests of me. But in hindsight, I realized they were actually doing that in the best interests of them and not me. Um, they did pay me well for the work, which is always really nice and always appreciated,
Yeah.
but I was also doing the work. And I found over time that my body was actually telling me things that I just wasn't listening to. I just felt it within me that there were several personal boundaries that had been crossed that I didn't really feel I could actually speak up and draw those strong
Can you
lines that I
talk about
needed.
those? Sorry,
Yeah,
Lisa, can
look,
you
I
talk
can.
about some of those behaviors for our listeners,
Yeah, look,
and some of those things
absolutely.
that you accepted? Because I think it's probably
Yeah.
important that we have that conversation.
Yeah, look, I'm really happy to do that. As I said, I was in one of those positions where I was really, really grateful for the opportunity that was being offered to me. And for lots of different reasons, I didn't actually, I felt that the most important thing was keeping the person who brought me into that environment happy was my primary goal,
Yes.
because I was so appreciative and, all the rest of it. And for lots of different reasons, I actually didn't feel like my contribution actually made a difference. But in hindsight, without me, that individual wouldn't have
Yeah.
been achieving the outcomes. And I know that about myself now, but we are talking about, a good 10, 15 years ago, maybe a bit longer than that. Um, what
Yeah.
I found in this particular environment was that it was one of those pat smack environments whenever things went well and this individual was positioned really, really well for the senior leaders meetings that they were going to and all that kind of thing, that individual would come back
Yes.
really, really happy and, we did a great job and bloody, bloody blur. And, the individual looked great because we knew that, myself and some of my colleagues were positioning that individual for success, knowing that it was our work that was being put up. Whenever things didn't go well, the individual was very, 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 in hindsight, again, I think she was quite an anxious individual as well. Was a female, quite an anxious individual. And whenever things didn't go well, because they weren't across the content, they weren't able to actually speak on the content beyond whatever had been pulled together to be presented or whatever else. The individual would come back to our work area and we would have hell for weeks and weeks and weeks. And the types of things that would play out was that we'd get really, really snide comments about, well, we didn't do that with this and this. Oh, that's good that you thought of that now. I needed that the other day when I was, presenting to XYZ or whoever else. I've also been in a couple of meeting environments where I would be openly chastised in front of other individuals about not speaking up and providing any insights or perspectives because I get paid really well. And what am I being paid for when I'm not actually,
Oh, wow.
They weren't actually getting their money's worth out of me because I wasn't, saying anything. And so, this particular event was a really interesting one, Toni, because I am actually quite open in speaking up when I've actually got something constructive to say that I feel provides value. So I was I remember the first time it happened, I was quite puzzled because I was like, why is all the attention being turned on me because I'm not speaking up? And we'd actually gone from that meeting right into another meeting. And at the second meeting, there was, again, different matters we were discussing. I was a participant at that meeting and I did have an insight and a perspective. And I opened my mouth to actually provide that insight and perspective. And I was shut down and told that when they wanted to hear my voice, they'd let me know. Otherwise, I have to sit there and be quiet. And so what would tend to happen, it's quite an ouchie, quite a bitey thing. But what tended to happen was the first time it happened, it was very, very puzzling and confusing. After that, it was almost like a level of conditioning where I never felt when I could speak up and I never knew when not to speak up. And of course, it's very embarrassing. It's quite humiliating to have your senior leader speak to you like that in front of another group of senior leaders, including your peers. And so you kind of stand back and go, well, as much as I wanted to have a big cry in the stairwell, the realities were that I never knew when to speak up and when not to. And I started actually holding things in, which is not healthy for anyone either, especially because I was passionate about the work and I really, really valued the role that I was in and I needed the job. And so over time, it wears you down and wears you down. And what I kind of found, in a lot of cases was that I was working incredibly long hours. What also didn't help was that what also didn't help, although I'm not sorry about this part, is that I had a really young family at home. I had 2 children in childcare. I think my son was just about to start kindy and I think I had a 7-month-old or an 8-month-old. So I was sleep deprived anyway. I also wasn't looking after myself. When I first entered into this work environment, I was quite fit, quite healthy. And I just found my food changed, my sleeping changed, my harmony in my household with a young baby completely changed because, routines change anyway. But I also think that my baby was actually getting vibes from me around the level of stress that I was actually carrying at the same time. And so the knock-on effect to being in these unhealthy work environments were really quite high. And what it really, really came down to, Toni, was that I didn't feel safe. There was no trust. There was no trust. I didn't trust myself and I didn't trust anyone else. I didn't feel safe, but I had to stay. And I had to stay for lots of different reasons, including the fact that I really, really love the work. And it is the same field that I work in now. How did that particular, dynamic end? It just so happens that leader ended up getting a role in another environment, in another area. And for some reason, they had the impression that I was actually going to be moving with them to that new environment. And that was apparently just an assumption because, as I mentioned, a lot of the outputs and the outcomes that were being presented at that level were mine.
Yes.
I was in much junior
Yes.
levels. I wasn't interested in moving on. And what ended up happening in this particular dynamic is that I didn't apply for any of the roles that were in the new structure in the area that they moved to. And this individual tried to make an arrangement with my new leader around still getting access to me, just like I was still working for them, even though I wasn't taking the roles. It was one of those situations, Toni. It was one of those situations, to be really frank with you and your listeners, it still haunts me now. I had one of my peers became my new leader, and my new leader had to negotiate with this previous leader to reinforce the fact that I was actually no longer owned by her. And I will never forget the day, Toni, that this individual came to me and said, I've just had a 2-hour shouting match with so-and-so about how, you and your role is actually not directly associated with the work being done at that level, but they still feel that they need to have access to you. And they've gone over both of our heads to the most senior leader. And as far as they're concerned, this is happening.
Oh my goodness.
And the individual that actually went into bat for me, my peer, who was my new leader, he was almost in tears. He was broken. And of course, because he was one of my peers, he was used to being worn down by this same leader as well. So he went into bat the best way he could, but he couldn't actually extract me or the role in the way that he was really hoping to. And I even now really appreciate him going into bat, because it's not every day you find a heart-centered governing leader who's going to actually step up and do the right thing. How did it all turn out? Well, let me tell you how it all turned out. That was a Monday that I had that meeting with him. And seeing how broken he was just really broke my heart. On Monday night, I jumped onto seek.com.au, which is a job website here in Australia. I went to my first job interview. I'd been with the organisation in its different forms for probably about 19 years. The business had broken apart, merged, and I had all these different roles. There was a couple of different faces of the same organisation. Even though the business changed, I was still going to the same building for 19 years. And I jumped onto Seek on the Monday night, and I actually went to my first formal external interview on the Friday of that week in the Sydney CBD for a role with another organisation, which I ended up getting 3 weeks later. And I ended up getting the role, which was wonderful. I came in and resigned. I think it's fair to say that my leader, while he was very disappointed, he told me he was very disappointed to see me go.
Cheering?
He was secretly cheering, because that was really the only way the ties could be cut in a way that was the most constructive. So it's kind of a sad outcome, but at the same time, it was a really amazing learning experience. Once you shake off the emotion around this stuff, it was great learning.
Absolutely great learning. From your perspective now, what advice would you give Lisa back then? How would you have managed that toxic situation?
Look, that's actually a really, really good question, because, we talk to ourselves about these things every time it kind of comes back up, for us in these different ways. One of the first things I think I would have told Lisa back then was that there's a really, really important word in the English language called perspective. And what I didn't realize back then was that the only perspective that seemed to matter to me was my boss's and no one else's, including my own. I'd actually forgotten that I forgot that I actually had my own perspective, and I actually had a right to share my perspective, constructively and appropriately. I don't think my leader was very, very open to that. That perspective was even sharpened for me further when I was leaving, because I received the most massive box of flowers, a box of roses, farewell and congratulations on your new job roses, from my previous leader, who wouldn't return my call, even though I rang to say thank you for them. Lovely, in an appropriate way to say thank you for this, very expensive box of flowers. And one of my dear friends that I was working with at the time, who I'm still close to now, said to me, that box of flowers isn't actually there to congratulate you, Lisa. It's actually to show everyone else in the organization that she didn't push you out. And that's what the messaging was. The indirect messaging throughout the organization was, this particular ego-centered leader has pushed along someone who's been in the organization for a very, very long time and got the relationship to a point where the only option I had was to move on.
Was to leave.
Because no one could save me. The only person who could save me, Toni, was me. And that's the second thing I would have told myself back then. You know, it took me a little bit of time to find myself again. And one of the things I did do was I did actually take up any support that was offered to me in my new role, in my new environment. So I was fortunate enough to be in an organization where all the senior leaders got the option of having a coach, an executive coach. Yes, which is actually quite a special offer, especially when the company pays, which is very, very rare. One of the other things I think I probably would have told myself in hindsight in that situation was that these types of amazing people are out there. These types of great mentors are out there.
Yes.
And as much as our budgeting process at home was quite tight with 2 young children in childcare and all the rest of it, I should have invested in my mental health more, and I should have invested with the right person, providing me the right type of perspective and support that I really needed, and not relied on my leader to also be my mentor, to also be, you know, who ended up being my owner, which is really quite terrible. You know, humans do not own humans. I enabled and I allowed all of that to happen. And, you know, now, today, I can own it. But back then, I think because of the perspective I had and because of the behaviors around me, it was much easier for me to blame everyone else. It was much easier for me to blame that leader for all the terrible things that happened and was said and all the rest of it. It was easier for me to do that instead of owning it and going, you know what, a lot of that I actually created for myself because I didn't speak up. I didn't have an opinion. I didn't have a perspective. I wasn't valuing myself. I didn't feel like I was worthy for the role, even though in hindsight, you know, I know what I was doing. And don't get me wrong, I wasn't the only team member going through this sort of stuff, but lots of different reasons. I think I was much more heavily triggered by her behaviour than a lot of the others. And some of that had to do with my conditioning in my home environment. You know, especially around angry people. The anger thing is something that, you know, it's easy to say there's no role for anger in the workplace, but some individuals don't have any self-control. They don't have any self-awareness. And for some, especially like myself back then, when anger's directed at me, the first thing I think of is, oh my God, what have I done wrong? As opposed to, wait a minute, you know, the first thing we need to talk about is the fact that you're speaking to me this way. I'm always happy to own if I've done something wrong, but I'm actually not going to have that kind of stuff thrown at me. And I wasn't drawing those lines. And
would you, retrospectively, would you have taken, would you, knowing what you know now, if you had access to that sort of coaching and leadership back then, would you have actually broached some of those subjects with her? Would you have actually pulled her aside and said, hey, you're not allowed to speak to me that way, it's not appropriate? Would you have done that? Or
I think it's actually a really good question. I think that I was so broken that it would have taken me quite a while to do it. And I think that I was probably at the point where I couldn't have had those conversations because I just had brought the relationship quite, you know, well and truly past that point. I do remember one instance where I was worn down so heavily by the behaviour and the dynamics playing out and all the rest of it that I did actually go into her office and tell her that I couldn't work with her anymore. And that was very close to the point where she was actually applying for these other roles anyway. So I got I got 2 weeks of the cold treatment, you know, the outer circle cold treatment. So she was one of those individuals that you're either in the inner circle and she'd smack and pat you, everything was wonderful, or the world was ending and you're in the inner circle, or you're in this you're in the Arctic outer circle, which is cold and and I wasn't even getting the information I needed to be able to do my job. And but that, I'd upset her because I told her that I couldn't work with her anymore. And
Yeah.
she was actually looking for the role. There was a lot going on at her level as well around restructures and stuff like
Yeah.
that too. And so
Yeah. Yeah.
again, there's a lot of context and a lot of perspectives that at the time I don't think I really considered. I did find out afterwards that there was some surprise around me not applying for the role that she applied for, and at the time she actually advised all of us direct reports that the roles weren't open to our level for application. But in actual fact, this particular role was designed. It was actually put into the structure quite late, and the role that she got was put in the structure quite late, and it was pretty much designed so that no one could apply for it but her. So these environments, these decision-making environments, are really, really quite something. And granted, it was 10 or 12 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that. But it's the kinds of things, Toni, that kind of, things that don't break you make you stronger. And I was fortunate, as I
Definitely.
said, for lots of different reasons, to be able to look back and, on a lot of the learnings from that environment that I was in, still delivering great governance to an organization, and really, I guess, get some personal learnings to go, okay, well, I know where my lines are now, and I am not afraid. I don't feel so unsafe that I can't speak up and hold lines. And if they disappoint others, then that's actually on them, because I'm not disappointing myself anymore. And that's what I really was doing. I was disappointing myself over and over again. It's really interesting, I think, in now to kind of look at now and some of the dynamics playing out within organizations with that context in mind.
Yes.
Because what we find is that there are a lot of individuals that have, similar, even worse, a lot worse stories than what I've talked about. I think I actually got quite lightly compared to others. I know others have had a far, far worse trot than I have with this workplace kind of dynamics playing out. And it has a lot to do with, as I said to you, this whole concept around safety, emotional safety.
Yes.
And as part of that, a big component is around trusting yourself and your own judgment, and trusting that the people around you are coming from a real leader and coming from a really, really good place. So a lot of the frameworks and policies and concepts that we use in my business within the Governance Collective have been developed and based on really great heart-centered governing leaders' focus and approach. And I have actually a couple of things I'd love to share with you and your listeners today.
Yes, please.
So can I go there now? Shall I do that?
Absolutely.
Let's do that. So you recall in the previous shows that we talked about trust and the components of trust, and that how each individual gets triggered by certain things, or certain variables around trust. And we talked about, examples like, transparency and authenticity and integrity and loyalty and all that kind of thing. We've actually done a little bit of work around what a heart-centered governing leader looks like when it comes to trust, what kind of behaviors they're actually exhibiting. And what I was thinking was that your listeners may like to hear about some of those examples to consider whether they're around a heart-centered leader or whether they're actually a heart-centered leader themselves. And so,
so they can recognize the traits of heart-centered leadership.
Absolutely, yeah. So heart-centered governing leaders, hopefully technology will behave itself today. Let's see if it does.
There we go.
There it is.
For those watching live, we have a wonderful graphic around trust. And for those that you are listening and not watching live, we actually have this as a downloadable on Radio Toni. Look under co-hosts and find Lisa, and you'll find this downloadable. And alternatively, you can always email Lisa for a copy of this, support@governancecollective.com. Now, Lisa, this is a beautiful graphic around trust. Can you explain it for our listeners and those watching today?
Certainly. So for those that are familiar with our previous trust diagram or cloud bubble, we recognize that trust has certain components to it or certain aspects, and each of those aspects may have been a trigger or a really, really strong trait within individuals. They're naturally loyal and they're naturally, act as they think. They have got really great alignment with their head, their heart, their gut, and they're really, really authentic humans. This particular diagram or bubble has been created so that you can recognize what you're doing and how you're being when you place trust in yourself. And this is how other people will experience and see you while you're being your true self. You're placing trust in your true self and you're being your true self. So I should qualify, this particular diagram was developed by myself and one of my colleagues, Michaela Diodario. And when we think about trust as a true self perspective, you actually listen and you act. You listen to and you act on your own intuition. So you know that voice in your head that's coming from your heart and from your gut, you're listening to that. And not only are you listening to that, you're actually having real conversations with yourself and with other people as part of that. So you actually got this discernment and you can recognize what's actually coming from your head and from your ego and what's actually coming from a truer place. And you know that about yourself. You have that level of self-awareness to know that that's actually coming from a place where X, Y, and Z, because I've been triggered by this and this, as opposed to going, no, you know what, from a pure heart-centered standpoint, this is where I'm coming from. And because of that, you feel quite connected and supported by the people around you. And you feel connected and supported with your true self and your higher self. And you feel grounded within your body around that as well. That whole piece around, well, where is this, that real conversation piece and listening to your intuition or listening to that inner voice really just comes from recognizing that we're always self-improving. There's no perfect human walking around this earth, or if they are, I'd certainly be surprised to find them. But there are a couple of politicians out there that might think that they are perfect, but
well, my brain was actually going to
I think
going to current leadership and thinking, I wish we could put this up on a billboard somewhere.
Yeah, look, exactly right. And I have actually got the second diagram I have for you is around how trust plays out for an ego-centered leader too. So you actually know whether you're around a heart-centered leader or an ego-centered leader. The great thing about continual self-improvement is that you actually learn about yourself and you know what your triggers are and you can proactively address them. So you know that sometimes things kind of just trigger you, or if for those of you out listening, you might have siblings that are really good at knowing exactly where to poke, just to give you a bit of a, get you going a little bit. I have two brothers that I love dearly who know exactly where to poke me. I know where my triggers are and I can proactively address them. Heart-centered leaders or heart-centered governing leaders who really do place trust in their true self are really clear on their intent, and they can distinguish between their ego and their true self when it comes to their intentions. So if you're actually you're making some decisions within your work environment and you've made certain decisions for certain reasonings, you can actually tell when it's your ego self getting someone back because they came late or did whatever, as opposed to this is actually the right person in the right role doing the right thing. I'm actually coming from a true self place because I know that my intentions are pure and they're clear. And that is really true selfers do that. True selfers totally do that. They also consider perspectives. So as I mentioned to you before, what would I say to the 10 years, 12 years younger Lisa back then? There are other perspectives out there. And if I was in that headspace where I was actually placing trust in my true self, I would like to think I would have been considering perspectives beyond my boss's perspective and no one else's. And I would have liked to think that I'd be a bit curious about what other people's perspectives are and why they are the way they are, including why my boss's perspective was the way it was. And it's kind of one of those things that then enables you when you have all those perspectives and you can, really kind of listen to your intuition and work through decision making more effectively. You actually can, you can actually really know that the true you is driving, the real you is driving, and not the
Yeah.
ego-centered you that is driving. And because of that, you have that inner strength to make them follow through on those tough decisions, because everyone is faced with tough decisions. And we talked
Yes.
last week about the difference between, a heart-centered leader that's just a softie who just kind of gives in and
Yes.
just sort of heart-centered, that just give in every time, as opposed to those
Yeah.
heart-centered governing leaders who can make the tough decisions, but really, really hold the line in a way that they know it's their true self driving, and it's not their ego self driving those tough decisions.
Yeah.
So, Toni, we've all been in situations where you've given a bit of bad news by someone and you're quite disappointed with that
Yes.
news. You kind of intuitively know. I know that I intuitively know that if someone really has to give me bad news, firstly, they're not scared to do it.
Yes.
Secondly, they have a real conversation with me around it. And if I'm actually receiving from them, I guess energetically or otherwise, that this is a situation that is what it is, and it isn't coming from a place of ego or from revenge or from any other
Yes.
motive. Their
Yes.
intentions are quite
Yeah.
pure. The actual
Yep.
news of that bad news, it's still bad news, but you can take it a little bit differently, and you can actually carry it differently, because it doesn't have that layer
Yes.
of intent, that nasty layer of ego-based intent. So
And that, I guess, is the difference between, if we talk about bad news in terms of having to lay people off, which I'm sure
absolutely,
many people have had
a
to do
lot of people are
through
doing.
2020.
Yeah,
If you if that news is delivered in a way that is considerate, understanding, and knowing of that employee's perspective, that news is delivered in a much nicer way, a much more helpful way, and a much more empowering way, because you want to empower the employee to understand, we can't keep you on anymore because of XYZ, but we want to give you the best opportunity to go on with your life, get another job, etc., rather than saying, oh, you're
yeah.
sacked, COVID's the problem. Uh, without, there's two ways of delivering that hard news, isn't there?
Oh, look, there definitely is. There most definitely is. And when you're coming from a true self and a heart-centered leadership or heart-centered governing leadership perspective, when you're willing to back yourself, especially in
Yeah.
the face of opposition, because some individuals are going to get angry first before they sit back and go, because their
Yes.
first response is, I've lost my job, the world's ending. And
Yes.
I can totally appreciate why they'd feel that. But at the same time,
Yeah.
you're actually in a position where you're responding and not reacting, because what can happen is that when an individual is, you're delivering bad news and that individual is reacting, you can then be triggered to
Mm-hmm.
react as well. Whereas if you're really clear on your intent and you know what your triggers are, you can proactively address them to self-improve, but you're also ready to respond and not react. And sometimes
Yeah.
individuals just need to let some steam off and let it out, as opposed to you escalating the matter further by you reacting to what they're saying and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
there are different ways of doing this, but you've got to be able to back yourself in that face of opposition. And if you're coming from a really good place and space and you're clear on your intent and you have considered all of those perspectives and you have listened and and the answer unfortunately still is what it is, you can
Yeah.
actually deliver that news being really, really well grounded and being true to yourself. Even though, as I said, the news isn't always, it is a tough decision, but it's a decision that has to be
Yeah.
made. And I know for a lot of leaders, they're deciding on whether the business is going to operate or they're going to, move on a couple of people. It's, do I lose 40
Yes.
people and all of our livelihoods, or do I move along 3? And we try and kind of reshuffle
We
things.
try and keep going. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's also about understanding that you're giving this person some incredibly shocking news, and they're going to be angry, they're going to be upset. And if you disregard their tears or anger uh, in a way that devalues them, you compound the effects of the news that you're giving.
Look, you do, and you also, and that compounding can actually impact their ability to be able to bounce back. And
Yeah.
one of the
Yeah.
things that I know that I always would like to think that the leaders that we work with, and the people around me in general, to be really honest with you, they're individuals that don't take the dignity from other people. You know, they create these spaces and these environments for individuals to be able to maintain a level of dignity. And even if they do lose in a one-on-one while you're advising them, unfortunately, they don't have a role anymore. Have some tissues ready, give them the time they need. Don't leave that room. Don't react. Work through it, offer them the opportunity to have a bit of a soft landing if you feel you've got that. If you know other people within the business community that might be hiring, or there might be some other way for you to be able to stagger their departure, even if it's a couple of days a week instead of time, or think about different ways and options of having softer landings for individuals, as opposed to that hard, thanks for coming, don't come back tomorrow.
Lisa, do you think that, particularly bearing in mind what the world's been through in 2020, the lead up to 2020 and going forward, do you think that heart-centered leadership and the components or elements of heart-centered leadership will become the embracing way to lead in the world going forward? Do you think that, and the other thing that I wanted to explore was the difference between men and women in terms of heart-centered leadership?
Look, really, really good questions, Toni. Both really good questions. I think over time, great employees are going to look for great leaders. I think that great employees that do great work, who actually start building, if they're not already building, a really good, a really, really good, healthy level of self-awareness. They value themselves. The kids that we're raising today are very, very differently wired kids to the generation that I came from, and the generation my parents came from, etc. I'd like to think that I'd like to think that my kids will actually know that they've got choice and they've got perspective and they've got space, that the conditioning and the environments that we're bringing our kids up in are very, very different. So I think the first answer is, well, let me put it this way. I know that my kids won't put up with it. I don't think my kids will tolerate some of the stuff I put up with. And
correct.
I also think that if they do have the type of work ethic that I'd like to think they do, or hopefully they have. They're going to be looking for leaders, heart-centered governing leaders that are really, really work hard at creating these really great environments to enable everyone to shine, these win-win great environments. Organizations like that are going to be able to be, they will be at the forefront. They will be at the forefront moving forward. But I will say to you that it's going to take a little bit of time for this to happen, Toni. And I know that during our pre-conversation chat, we talked about the Aquarian age and the start of a new 10-year cycle that has started around that rebalancing piece. And that kind of links to your second question around females and the rising of females. I follow a really wonderful, wonderful, amazing woman named Elizabeth Peru. She has a wonderful community of individuals who consider what is actually occurring within our planet energetically. And she's talked very much around how with this Aquarian age starting from 2020 onwards, that there is a rebalancing and an equilibrium of the role of males and the role of females within society. And so I do think that, again, it's going to take a little bit of time, but females are actually rising. But the important thing I think that all of us need to remember, not just females, but males as well, is that females rising doesn't mean that they're actually rising above the males to do exactly what the females have experienced. It really is more about equality and equalness, and recognizing that every individual has a contribution. Or the differences are really important, because we can leverage our differences. It enables agility within home and work environments, it is a very, very big changing world, and it hasn't actually, in my personal view, taken COVID to change the world. It's actually changing anyway. I think COVID has actually given us all a good shake. It's given us a good shake and the kickstart. And I think that heart-centered governing leaders they are the leaders of the future. I also do think that the rise of heart-centered governing leaders being more female-oriented is highly likely, much highly
Yeah.
likely,
Yeah.
because females haven't actually been indoctrinated or conditioned in the home environment with a level of superiority that some males have within some cultures.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that,
And I know we talked about this in our pre-show meeting about the age of patriarchy and white male privilege, and we don't talk about that to denigrate men or the
no,
male of the species. We talk about it, and we will need to keep talking about it until there's equality across the world. And so we bring it up again today that life is different for many men than it is for many women. And whilst women have wonderful and amazing abilities to lead, and we're seeing some of those female leaders rise up across the world. For example, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand is a prime example of a heart-centered leader. If you
absolutely.
transfer that and compare someone like Jacinta to the leadership of the United States, you will clearly see the difference. And I know who I'd like to be leading my country. I want a heart-centered leader. I want someone who has the best interests of humanity ahead of their own, interests, ahead of their own desires, but the greater humanity takes first place in our lives. And I have to believe that things are changing in leadership across the world. I have to believe that we will have a whole generation of heart-centered leaders, both female and male, because men have amazing capacity to be heart-centered leaders. They just need to tap into their heart versus their ego, which is somewhat tougher for the male of the species.
Look, it definitely is, and I share your sentiments around that leadership, and with Jacinta especially. It is it is it is the mark of a great leader to be able to make those tough decisions and stand by them in a way that they're
Yes,
happy to be held to account, and they're making the
yes,
decisions for the many and not for the few. And so
correct.
when there are decision making that only benefits a few and it doesn't benefit the many, you know that you're actually not dealing with a heart-centered governing leader. You're dealing with an egocentric leader that has jobs for
Yes.
the boys. A dear colleague of mine, a shout out to my colleague Irene Lomas. I'm not sure if she's listening today or not.
Hello, Irene.
Hi, Irene. I'm not sure if there's I'm not sure if she's in a meeting or not today, but she highlighted this article that she saw yesterday around company directors. There's
Yes.
the New Daily, newspaper, online newspaper,
Mm-hmm.
had an article around company directors being the one job where pay and performance don't actually matter. And this
Yeah.
amazing article, and I'll include the link in the blog for this
Yes.
week. This article actually talked about there being a significant increase in females on boards, around 30% increase. There was
Yes.
10% and now there's 30%, which is wonderful.
Yes.
However, what's
Yes.
actually occurring based on this article is that the jobs that used to be for the boys are now the jobs for the boys and the girls who behave the same way as the boys. So in other words,
Yes.
it used to be a boys' club. It's now a boys and girls club, but only for those girls that behave the same
Girls
way
who
the boys
behave
do.
like boys.
And so
Yep.
keeping in mind that we naturally hire in our own image. So the decision
Yep.
makers around who gets on boards, it's very insular, and it's based on who they
Yes.
know and which role they're in. And, once you know someone on
Yeah.
one board, help you get on another board. And it's who you
Yeah.
know, not what you can do and what outcomes you can achieve. There's no performance metrics in place. It's the one job where pay and performance do not matter. And this article was a really, really hot, bright sort of bright beacon. I'm
Yes.
about to actually provide the link on LinkedIn for those that follow me on LinkedIn as well, for those that are interested.
And we'll
I
put it up on
Yeah.
our links to Lisa as well.
Yeah, that'd be really great. So I guess rounding out this piece around heart-centered governing leaders placing trust in themselves, they do have deep
Yes.
trust, and they really allow that deep trust. They allow the real situational dynamic to reveal itself over time. So heart-centered
Yes.
governing leaders may not be super fast decision makers because it's not their ego going, yes, 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 no. It is them actually
Yeah.
connecting and going, doesn't sit right with me. I'm not
Taking the
ready to
time.
yet. Take the time. They have their ego in check, and the ego is the passenger in the passenger seat. And they have this inner knowing, and they know that if they're not ready to make a decision, they know that their decisions within them and they have to work it through. Whereas when you look at placing your trust in your ego-centered self, and this is for those listeners who are wondering whether they're an ego-centered leader or whether their leaders around them are ego or heart-centered, when it comes to placing trust in your ego self, this is what you're doing and how you're being when you do that. You actually use your position and role to feed your ego. You have this warped belief that you believe that your ego is all of you and that you actually, this is just me being me, as opposed to going, wait a minute, you know, there's a big mask that you've slapped on that face, and you're actually doing that in a way that, you know, you just believe that is you, and, you know, how great am I? And it links back to the piece around perfectionism that we talked about. You are perfect and you're not interested in self-improvement because, you know, once you make perfection, what else is there to improve? What ego-centered leaders also do is they suppress and deny their deeper knowing. And this is what actually happened to me in my story earlier, Toni. I actually knew I wasn't in a good place and space. I knew the behaviors around me were inappropriate. I suppressed and I suppressed and I suppressed. And then my body started telling me otherwise. My body was going into fight and flight, and I was going into panic. And and of course, I was the ultimate, you know, I was a martyr. My martyrdom was right up there. Couldn't delegate. I'm the only one who can do it. I'm the only one who can do it properly, and I could not ask for support, even though I really, really needed the support. Ego-centered leaders naturally like to control others, and they lay blame, and they also play
They
this.
don't accept.
They are suffering in silence. And what ends up happening is they feel superior, and then they actually inwardly feel inferior because the mask that they've put on doesn't really quite fit. So inferior, superior, inferior, superior, they switch and switch and switch. And that's why sometimes, I know that in my particular story from earlier, that particular leader I was working with, I never knew which person I was going to get, the inferior, you know, worn down one, or the look out, you spoke at the wrong time or you didn't speak up one. They are very disconnected. They can be adversarial. They do burn bridges. They kind of go, you know what, stuff you. If you don't like who I am and how I'm being, that's a problem for you, not a problem for me. As opposed to saying, how much of this is actually mine? How much do I own? And how much is actually, you know, on the other individual. They see themselves as the only priority. So if you're an ego-centered leader or you're an ego-centered individual, your priority is you and no one else, because you never feel safe or protected. So the only person you can rely on is you and no one else. No one can touch you because, you know, you've got you and that's it. And it actually links to that behavior around acting untouchable. You know, those senior leaders who think that, no, they're not going to send me anyway. They wouldn't get the sales they get, you know, without me, bloody blur, even though there's a team but beneath them who are putting up with the behavior and doing the work anyway. That mask wearing piece that I mentioned to you earlier, Toni, they actually do feel like frauds, but some individuals actually push this feeling down so heavily over time. A lot of individuals actually learn it in their own conditioning, in their own home environments. So they end up behaving, you know, especially for males, they end up behaving like their fathers, and their father expects them to, you know, man up and behave a certain way. And, you know, their father's father expected them to man up and behave a certain way. And if they didn't, they were soft and, you know, all the rest of it. And as part of that, unfortunately, they learn to prey on the weak. So as soon as they see vulnerable people, they prey on them because it makes them feel bigger and it makes the individuals feel smaller. And they're really conscious of their image. and they define themselves by
Yes.
what they do, not who they are and how they're being. So I
Yeah.
realize there's quite a lot of content here, Toni, and I'm really conscious of the time, because I know that
I
we've
know.
been
I was just going to
talking
say
around this.
we're going to have to round out today's show, and I didn't want to finish without you mentioning your upcoming webinar series.
Oh, yes. So what we've done in the Governance Collective is built a couple of hours of training for heart-centered governing leaders. It is a
Yes.
heart-centered governing leadership training course, but what we're actually doing is we're helping individuals get great tools and techniques for governing organizations where they have more of a heart-centered approach. And as part of
Yes.
that, we're also helping individuals identify if they're ego or heart-centered, and
Yes.
helping them with different techniques to manage ego-centered leaders if they have them around them. So you might be a heart-centered
Fantastic.
person, and we're providing, I guess, some insights and perspectives to help individuals manage the ego-centered leaders that might be around them right now. So we'll be selling that.
Fantastic. Lisa's link to that training will be available on her website and also on mine, Radio Toni, thegovernancecollective.com.au, or email Lisa at support@thegovernancecollective.com. We are completely out of time. What a fascinating discussion we've had this week. We will be back next week with more from Lisa on Radio Toni Everyday Business, where we talk about the amazing things that you can do to improve the way that you do business in the world. So we will be back next week. Don't forget to check out the blog, and Lisa's blog in particular goes up early each week, the week following the show, and all the links to any of the things that we've spoken about today, radiotoni.com or thegovernancecollective.com.au. Lisa, thank you so much. We are completely out of time. Wonderful talking to you, and I can't wait for our next show. Bye for now,
Thank you.
everyone.
See ya. Bye, everyone.